Joey is a clinical professor and a former Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Philippines, Manila. Very distinguished academic. He was the editor-in-chief of the Philippine Journal of Otolaryngology. He's an ENT surgeon, and it's really a great pleasure to have Joey here. He's also a former president of APAMI. Joey, welcome.
Salamat po, Nick. Thank you. Magandang umaga po sa kanilang lahat. Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Awabakal and Woromi peoples, and pay respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. It is an honor to moderate this next session, which had a tricky title and an even trickier biodata. I had to ask Mark, are you sure that the name of your organization is a tricky goose training? So we're going to learn about geese, I reckon. Maybe not. He's a council member of COPE and director of Tricky Goose Training. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mark Hooper.
Yes. Oh, well, real pleasure to talk to you. Yes, Tricky Goose, no mistake. That is my name, the name of my small company. And it's a real pleasure to speak with you. I don't often have an opportunity to engage with this group, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners as the Awabakal and, as I learnt this morning, the Woromi people, Woromai people, just north of here. I come from Brisbane, from the lands of the Turrbal and Yugara people, and it's great to be in Newcastle. I'm the founder and director of Tricky Goose Training. It's a small company in Australia that designs engaging training courses to promote quality research. We license training courses here in the UK, and we're talking to some institutions in Southeast Asia, growing quite quickly. I'm also a council member for the Committee on Publication Ethics, as many of you will know. And I'll sort of represent both at different times in this talk. I think it will be clear to you which I'm doing at which time. So here's what I'm going to speak about. I'm going to have a focus on education. That's what I know, and that's perhaps the value I can add in this discussion. I'm going to introduce the supply chain as a useful metaphor. And this is quite a speculative part of my talk. One thing perhaps you should know is I have no expertise in medicine. I was originally a philosopher, and I think the chief trait of a philosopher is they're happy to speculate in public. So that's what I'll do, and I'll expect you to disagree with me and think about it. But I'm going to introduce the supply chain as a metaphor for tackling tricky questions. I'm then going to talk about one tricky question, which is paper mills, which I bet you're familiar with. And then I'm going to try and put it together, apply the metaphor to the tricky question. I'm going to suggest some actions and offer some free resources you could use. When I was asked to speak here, I didn't know too much about APAMI, and so I looked it up because I'm neither an editor nor a medical profession, but I was pleased to see quickly that many of your goals are about education and training. And so I thought, we have common ground here. It'd be a great place for me to share. And I see that through these objectives, you hope to disseminate high-quality, evidence-based information. So Tricky Goose has much in common with this. We develop training courses. We license them predominantly to institutions. They're online training courses. We also license them to, I think, 5 or 6 medical research institutes in Australia. Not yet Hunter, but we could do something about that. So we have much in common, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. So the supply chain as a metaphor. So this occurred to me because I've been developing training for some time. And 15 years ago, I developed training for a container port. And I love container ports, right? I didn't know anything about it. But I had this job to take the expertise of experts in this area, put it together, and make a workshop that was specifically designed to address problems in the port supply chain. Some of you will have seen much bigger ports. I worked at the Port of Melbourne, which is Australia's largest port, but pales in comparison to some Southeast Asian ports, let's say. But a quick walk through this supply chain. It's a simplified version. There are exporters, perhaps they grow wheat, perhaps they produce wine. They put their produce into containers, which come in 2 sizes, like Lego blocks, 20 foot, 40 foot. They go on huge container ships. They're unpacked at the other end by stevedores, the ports with the cranes and all the fancy equipment. They're transported by road or rail or perhaps both, and to importers. And what I learned in doing this, and we iterated many times, and we had workshops with all of these stakeholders, is that although they all move the very same containers and are all very much concerned with the efficiency of the same supply chain, they have very different motivations and drivers within that supply chain. They don't understand each other. They often hate each other. They blame each other for inefficiencies, and no single player in the supply chain can, by themselves, affect the incentive structure of the whole supply chain. And I thought to myself that this should be extremely familiar to those of us who work in the research supply chain, right? And so I'm going to talk to that, and this is the speculative part of my talk. I'm going to walk through it. I'm not by any means trying to teach you about the research supply chain. I think many of you will know it better and perhaps have suggestions in how to draw this diagram better, and I'd welcome those. But we've got different kinds of funding, perhaps grouped into public funds, industry funds, philanthropy funds, which are given to researchers or institutions. Most researchers are in institutions and with students, supported by professional services. Those researchers submit work to journals or to books, which are often parts of publishers, perhaps related to preprint servers. Media plays a role in dissemination, and of course there are all kinds of consumers of research, other academics, the public, industry, and so forth. Now, our supply chain is complicated in many ways because people have different functions. I bet many of you have this function, which is to be both an editor and an academic, perhaps in an institution. And of course, when it comes to peer review, the process is non-linear, right? So our supply chain is sometimes non-linear and very complex. There's also the fact that within any of these models, there are a whole host of roles, and the interactions between those roles, even within one part of the supply chain, I think affects inefficiencies, is the cause of challenge, perhaps between editors and boards, between journals that are different, owned by publishers. So our supply chain is very complex. And it's obviously more complex than I've drawn here. I've added just two more bits, registration and repositories, because I think they're important. I have a much more complex version of this diagram that my wife, who is smarter and wiser, looked at and said, you should not show that, because it's madness, it's just lines everywhere. But I'd welcome your thoughts about how to make it better. Before I progress, I have one question for you about this. You no doubt find yourself at different places in this supply chain. And the question is, if you could change if you're concerned with promoting quality research and you could tweak just one part of this supply chain, where would you make that tweak? Which part? Would it be to funding bodies, institutions, publishers? Perhaps I won't ask you now, but I'd be very interested by your perspective at question time. Moreover, I'd be interested in whether that's in the place you work or whether it's someone that directly interfaces with you or someone very far removed from you. Because I can tell you in my experience of port supply chains, they always want to make the tweak to the person with whom they directly interact and are extremely frustrated with. Now, that's the metaphor, and now I'd like to apply it to a tricky problem. For my purpose, it's about training. So I think this is a useful metaphor because obviously when you're making training, you should make it for your audience, where they fit in this supply chain. But it's also beneficial in training for people to understand the whole thing, and moreover to understand the perspectives of those with whom they regularly interact in order to understand how to resolve challenges. So paper mills, how many people are very familiar with paper mills? Yeah, I'd say most, but not all. My question is, how should we provide training about paper mills? So paper mills, as a reminder, I won't dwell on any point, are the malevolent companies that generate and sell fraudulent manuscripts to researchers. And they've also been called a kind of organised crime in the landscape of scholarly publishing. And it's remarkable how organised paper mills are. I never would have guessed. I have a quick walkthrough. This is a diagram we use in our training. It's one possible configuration of a paper mill. So they start with trash data. There are varying degrees of trash, In some cases, it might be real data, very quickly and sloppily produced, but in some cases, it's just fabricated data, just made up. They're not in the business of doing slow research that takes 2 years. They're in the business of churning out data. So I think trash is a fair thing to call it. This is much easier with generative AI, and the paper mills have made very good use or bad use, depending on how you look at it, of generative AI. Often they'll submit to multiple journals simultaneously and then simply abandon the manuscripts that aren't accepted, which is a bad practice in itself, but if you're a paper mill, makes sense. It's just improving your time. They will Find friendly editors. I use this word loosely, but they target editors. If they find an editor who's willing to accept their papers, they're going to get more, right? Because paper mills are just trying to find the path to success. There is some research to show that editors have been bribed in this sense. Some paper mill papers go through normal peer review, and some are difficult to spot in peer review. Others are completely shoddy, and it's clear that rigorous peer review simply hasn't occurred, and there are a variety of ways in which that could happen. Now here's, of course, the commercial aspect. Paper mills sell authorship places, usually on accepted papers, to researchers who feel under desperate pressure to publish or perish, I suppose, to improve their publication count or their impact. And the ads often look something like this. They're clever. They surge price according to the impact factor of the journal. They love impact factors because they sell better. And they surge price according to the perceived prestige of the authorship place. They sell them to desperate academics. They also sell citations, by the way. Have you seen that? They're maximising their business model. They sell authorship places, they sell citations on those papers. They're trying to maximise their gain. And of course, it leads to real harm, right? This is polluting the literature. It's a terrible thing. One in every how many medical papers do you think is generated by a paper mill? It's a very unresolved question. So there's various papers about this. This one puts the estimate, and if you read the bottom line then, among biology and medicine papers, the rate rises to 3%, right? But I think that would put it at 1 in every 33 papers. That alone would be alarming. If 1 in every 33 published papers was produced by this shoddy process, that is cause for alarm. But I know many who work in this field who think that's a very low estimate, and the real number is much higher. I don't know. You might also then think, you might confuse it with predatory publishing and think it's only in very low quality journals, but that's not the case. I'm using here, quartiles as some proxy for journal prestige, and as you can see, some 30% in Q1 journals, 45% in Q2. So this is absolutely not the same problem as predatory publishing or anything like that. Are we susceptible? Absolutely, in Asia Pacific, we are susceptible to paper mills. So this COPE and STM report, which is very good, I'd recommend you read it, found in this sample fake papers with corresponding authors. They looked at only corresponding authors, over 70 countries in the world from a sample of 3,440. And note here that they found from the 3,440 submissions they looked at, not published papers, submissions, more than half they suspected were fake papers. So that's a striking number. It's a weird thing. I've worked in research integrity before I focused full-time on training. I managed research integrity for a university, the Queensland University of Technology. And I remember about 10 years ago, there was a real shift in the integrity space. It said, the problem's not really fraud, which is only committed by a few bad apples, hence this apple. The problem we have to focus on is questionable research practices. We really changed our focus to p-hacking and all that sort of stuff. But these paper mills give us pause to think maybe systematic fraud is a problem, as well. Not just a few bad apples, but systematic fraud. So a hard problem. Okay, so what should we do? And in my context, what should we do in terms of education and training? So I want to apply the metaphor to the very tricky problem. And I think it helps to think about how this problem looks to each part of the supply chain. So I'm going to start down the bottom right with sleuths and meta-researchers. They're not quite the same thing. By sleuth, I mean someone who identifies problems, perhaps posts about them on PubPeer, the people who are kind of like whistleblowers for the quality of scientific research. And meta-researchers are people who are working on this in a more systematic way. But they're often the same people. How do you think they feel by paper mills? I think they feel extremely frustrated, and I know they do, having spoken with them. There are many cases of journals being incredibly slow to retract obviously fraudulent papers. Whistleblowers flagged 300 scientific papers for retraction. Many journals just ghosted them, right? In that same paper, retractions come slowly, often years after complaints arise, if at all, in part because journals may defer to institutional investigations, which can be slow, unreliable, or absent. Journals' decisions also lack transparency. So I think this is how it appears to the sleuths. Now, there's a good consultation paper put out by the United to Act group, which I'll talk about more in a minute, but offers this sort of advice to sleuths, to contact the journal publisher directly, to be professional, because not all of them are, right? I wonder how your journal staff think of, some are trolls, some are very rude. I think sometimes that's understandable, motivated by the slow times and the perception of dramatic fraud. They can consider contacting the institution. They can consider contacting COPE if the journal or the institution is a member of COPE. And they should understand journal and publisher perspectives, that cases may be handled in order of severity rather than order of receipt. And so I think there's an important interface between how journal staff think and interact with sleuths and meta-researchers. COPE, I'd flag, has really useful guidance in this respect. This is a nice little resource full of flowcharts and diagrams you could use both for process and for educative purposes about how to deal with systematic manipulation of the publication process. So I'd recommend looking that up. And of course, we know that there are markers now, which I think journal staff need to know about paper mills. I think, as Ginny mentioned earlier, to find them before publishing them. One marker is that authors change between acceptance and publication. That's the whole business model, really, that an accepted paper is a commodity that can be sold. Non-institutional email addresses are one indication, although that depends by country. Figures contain duplications or are too clean. Figures appear in other papers. Missing ethics approvals. Structural similarity is a big one. They have templates that they use. About those, by the way, I have a suggestion, and I'd love your thoughts about it for the first of those, which is that I know many journals have rigorous processes for documenting author changes, but those aren't open. One thing that would really be a barrier to paper mills is if there was a section at the bottom of a paper that stated simply whether the authors had changed since submission. It wouldn't be a bad thing. That can happen for good reasons, but it would make patterns of authorship changes much easier to identify. So that's just a suggestion. In terms of image duplication, Tricky Goose makes training resources. We have a game. I'd be happy to give you one of these cards if you catch me later. It's a little game to identify image duplications between panels. What about the editor? The editor has, you can do a lot in this publication supply chain in terms of your editorial policies. So what you require can make your journal less susceptible to paper mills. Paper mills don't want to spend 2 years doing research. They don't. They just start from the writing the manuscript. So if you require registration, at least for a large subset of articles, they are very unlikely to have that registration and may well stop targeting your journal. Institutions. Let's take some water. How should institutions think of this? There was a cool blog. This is written by Dorothy Bishop. It's just on a blog, and it references Harry Potter. I don't know how familiar medical editors are with the esteemed works of J.K. Rowling, but I like them. And she makes the point that what we need is something like a defense against the dark arts course. So in Harry Potter, there's a defense against the dark arts course, and the teacher says, the dark arts are always evolving, they're always tricky, they're mysterious. As soon as you swat them in one place, they come up in another place. And so the point of defense against the dark arts is that our job, insofar as we're researchers, is to be just as clever and as devious as the dark, people themselves. And so I think it's a good idea for a course. There's also the fact that students and researchers are doing great work in this space. This paper by Jennifer Burns' group, these flaws which led to the identification of paper mill activity were in fact identified by undergraduate students. And the first author here, Danielle Ost, who's fantastic, was herself, at least at the time, an undergraduate of a great paper. And what about in institutions, our culture and our incentive structures? I think that's a huge thing. So obviously the way that academics are rewarded is a huge driver of paper mills. If we think this about H-index, if we think this about impact factor, this is absolutely, paper mills are preying on the perverse incentive structures of academia. And so how we think about that will absolutely make changes. There was a cool webinar or conference in the UK run by these excellent people, one session, and their talk, their provocation for a panel was, if we continue to talk about research integrity, research assessment, and research culture separately, we're frankly wasting our time. I think that's true. I very much subscribe to the view that research integrity, research quality needs to be understood in the context of research assessment and culture. Here's a case that might persuade you of that, and it's in the US, obviously a well-established research culture, and it's in the field of medicine. And it's about firms that are offering services to boost students' publication counts so they can get positions in academia or residencies. And it's very borderline whether to count these as paper mills. I would value your perspectives. One Arizona-based firm, clients pay $275 to just be part of a web-based cross-sectional study that can be completed in 2 to 3 weeks and submitted for publication. So the idea is you pay a small fee, really, and you churn out research in 2 or 3 weeks to boost your CV. In Texas, a $4,500 online course spanning 6 to 12 months promised 4 abstracts and 4 full-length papers. And in California, a program highlighted a recent graduate who landed a residency after adding 34 publications to their CV after one of these programs. And so they're very tricky cases because students may well be learning as part of these programs. They may well be contributing to research. And so if you put them through, let's say, an institutional research integrity investigation, they may well be able to argue that they made a significant scholarly contribution to these works. But this is not the kind of research we want to. It's clearly, manufacturing heaps of shoddy research, and is sort of, maybe the question is not, are they paper mills, but are they a bit paper milly, and should we be concerned about them? Actions and takeaways. So one is, I just propose this as a model. I think it's a useful way. Perhaps in your organisation, you're concerned with providing training and education. That's one of the goals of APAME. I think it's worth thinking, who am I providing training to? Is it worthwhile for them to understand the broader perspectives of the whole research supply chain? And is it particularly valuable for them to think about how the problems appear from other people in the supply chain with whom they interface and who they may blame for certain quality problems? I think that's a useful discussion. Let me put on my COPE hat for just a second. How many people know about United to Act? Oh yeah, a few? Not heaps. Okay, United to Act is a great thing. It is a joint project from COPE and STM. It's a group of international stakeholders working collaboratively to address the collective challenge of paper mills in scholarly publishing. What I like is it's a good example of the supply chain. The point is that collective effort is needed because no individual can solve the problem alone. And so there are a lot of streams to United to Act, to increase education and awareness, which I care about, to improve post-publication corrections, to catalyse research, to develop trust markers, ways we can sort of track this at a large scale, and to facilitate dialogue between stakeholders. And you can certainly become involved in United to Act, and I would encourage you to. Working groups have already prepared draft resources as a first step, and you could just go to this site, or just Google it, and your feedback would be so welcome on those draft resources. They will certainly be taken into consideration for future revisions. From Tricky Goose's perspective, we make resources to sort of help in this space. We have a lot of resources that look like this. This is just the one on paper mills, because I'm talking about it today. And this is free for you to use and download if you'd like to use it. It's just a discussion primer. It's an A3 discussion primer to promote discussion about this within your labs, about what paper mills are, might they affect us? If so, how might they affect us? How might they affect your journal, your editorialship? And we have a corresponding video. I don't know if it will autoplay. It has sound, of course. I won't play the sound, but it talks through paper mills and provides a nice introduction. So those, you could get them at that hyperlink, or you could just Google us. But their resources are free to use under Creative Commons license. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mark. That was an excellent presentation. And before we open the floor for questions, let me throw the first question. You asked what I might or what we might change in your model.
Yes.
And so my answer will be based on the producer-consumer continuum in the supply chain. Why did you not start with the authors or researchers as the producers or exporters, and instead start with the funders? Yeah.
Yes. Okay, it's a wonderful question. I love it because my presentation is gone. I was going to put it up on the screen. But so both in the research supply chain and in the port supply chain, that question occurs. So when we did it with the port supply chain, the importers would say, "Why don't you start with us? We pull it forward," and the exporters think it should begin with them. Thank you. I think it's cyclical, is the truth. I think that consumers should drive, let's say, public funding, and I think institutional leaders should, I think one of their responsibilities is to drive public funding in good ways. So I think that's the solution. Is that fair? A cyclical model.
Okay, so we'll go to the floor.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. Okay, and 4. So Ginny first. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Fantastic presentation, of course. So I get my question. So since starting at the MJA, I have to say this has kind of risen right to the top of the things that I care about. And I just wonder if one of the things that is stopping more discussion about it is there's kind of almost an element of shame of, you know, kind of, well, first off, if you've published these papers, that's terrible. The fact that you're getting them, why are we getting them? Do you think, I mean, is that anything that's been considered? Because one of the things I'm very aware of is I kind of have a duty to write about the experiences that we've had, and they're pretty shocking, actually, but I suspect that others might feel less confident in speaking up.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think you and others in the room might know more, but I will say some things, which is I think we should destigmatise it. Is one thing I think. I think we should destigmatise retractions more generally. I know this is a slightly a side topic, and there's a lot of debate about whether to destigmatise retractions. People who are against it point out that most retractions are for reasons that are bad, speak badly of the authors. But I think we should just destigmatise retractions themselves and instead look at what's stated in the retraction notice. You know, if it was fraudulent, that would be worse. In the case of paper mills, I think it's quite similar. I think it would be probably shameful to accept that paper with the rat, you know, the fabricated crazy rat. But I think some of the papers that have been made by paper mills are genuinely very persuasive. And and the way they've been uncovered by good meta researchers is in systematic, reviews of the way that they're templated across time, the way that cells are misspelt, really unique features. So I think there's no shame to be had in having accepted some paper mill papers, and I think proactive action would be the best way. I know the people, I mean, for example, Wiley's been through a huge thing, obviously, right? I know the people at Wiley's. I mean, I like them, but I think they've made a good response. You know, that they've stepped up and handled it well in response to what was a terrible thing, I think.
Thanks very much, Mark. Paul Moyedi, Master. So, in answer to your question with regards to which you want to change, what I would argue, if you keep that slide up, actually, it's fine. What's different about academic publishing to what you have here is that there is one place where everyone contributes to all bits, which is the institutions. So as an academic, I sit on panels that decide funding. I am in an institution. I'm also an editor of a journal, and I consume it as an academic. So that is unusual in this type of supply chain thing. So what I would suggest is that perhaps the institution is the most important, not because they're the most important thing, but because they have the manpower that contributes to all the other sections that you have. And really it's about perhaps both, at the moment it's all about positivity of publishing. There has to be more consequences if you do bad things. So if you, as an author, start using paper mills, you should be sacked from institution. That would be a very strong signal not to do that. But I'd be interested in your thoughts.
No, I like your thoughts. I like the idea that this is and should be, I think at least it should be, an academic-led supply chain, the research one, right? I don't know that it always is, but insofar as it is, I think it just points to a more nitty-gritty problem, which is that if researchers are wearing all these different hats, right? If it's all researchers, why then do we have these barriers of communication and problems that arise? You know, your researcher qua funding body advisor, your researcher qua, editor, and yet editors and researchers often collide. I know for a fact in integrity investigations, publishers and institutions don't speak well with one another. But if it's researchers all the way down, that's a strange problem to explain. Yeah. It's just a question, not a solution. Happy to chat later. Yeah.
Nick and then Iman.
So, Mark, a brilliant talk. Really enjoyed it. Very, very instructive. And I like the supply chain analogy. I think it's just brilliant. I want to ask you, it really follows on from Paul's question. Paul's right, the institutions are where things can be made different to change. But actually the problem, frankly, besides the paper mill drivers, the mafia group doing this, are the academics who actually accept authorship. Is there any legal framework anywhere in the world around this? Because I would have thought this should be, basically illegal. I mean, essentially it's fraud.
Yes.
And you could argue to take a legal framework and not just sack them, but actually have legal penalties in place for this. And that's something governments can enact, and that's something you could promote for enactment to make a difference. Because if you're right, it's 1 in 33 or more that are fake papers, essentially completely fake research, which is distorting the literature. It is terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, that means you can't trust what we publish. And that's the end of, science in medicine, if that's the truth. So we've got to stamp this on. This is more than just a few bad apples. This is actually a threat, an integral threat to everything we do and believe in. And it's got to be stamped out. And the only way I could see to do this is to hit the researchers, make it really, you don't want to get caught, because if you do, you really are in trouble. It's more than just being fired.
Yes.
What do you think?
No, I think it's a great point. I very much agree about the size of the threat. I speak with many people who say that science is self-correcting, but of course it's only self-correcting if we correct it. So here we must do this. We have a big task ahead. On the legality thing, I simply don't know, but I do know other researchers are pushing in the same direction. I've seen a lot of similar calls for making it a criminal act, but I just don't know myself.
So Eamon, and then 1, 2, 3.
Thanks, Mark. I don't know if we have time, but I'm sure there's a ping there that to warn us about time. But just very quickly, hypothetically, an editor gets notified about a paper that has been suspected, to be one of those products, and you're asked to look into it. I mean, if I were asked to look into it, I would be just like a detective. I would go and look at all the names of the authors, look at their output, and see whether this was a feasible, accusation or not. But is that enough? I mean, is that relies on my kind of detective powers? But is there something your publisher has said? We suspect that this may be, a paper that has gone through this paper mill process, and we want you to look into it. Is there anything more formalized? Is there anything where there's a? I'm sure this is part of your training, but it's just, is there something that we as editors should be trained to do to kind of pick out some telltale signs of this activity?
Yes, I'm not an expert, but COPE, for whom I'm a council member, has excellent resources in this space. Those flowcharts I spoke to make it easier, at least knowing what you might do in those cases. I think part of it is, as you say, looking at the evidence before you. You may have to sleuth yourself, although a lot of it's already been done on PubPeer. There are so many of these coming that the evidence is laid out quite nicely on PubPeer. I used to work for an institution that would have wanted to know, so I think telling the institution is a good idea if you suspect any misconduct. Not all institutions may share that view, but I think they're the steps you take.
Thank you very much. I am Professor Dr. from Bangladesh. Mark Hooker, your nice and tricky presentation. Congratulations to you. What are the crucial barriers to prepare the tricky questions? May I know from you, please?
Sorry, crucial barriers to?
Crucial barrier on prevent the tricky questions.
Preventing tricky questions?
Yeah.
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, I'm biased, but I think education and training is the need for better education and training, I think, is one of the barriers to these problems arising. If I could pick one, I asked you the question, where would you make a change? I would make changes to the incentive structures for researchers. I agree that this supply chain is or should be led by researchers. I think, therefore, those researchers should, in all their various positions, take control of the incentive structures by which they're evaluated. So I think that's the chief barrier.
Gerald Holtman from the University of Queensland. Very nice presentation. And I really liked the value chain. And I like Paul's comment that it's unique that in medicine, single individuals are playing multiple roles. They are researchers, they are decision makers, funding allocators, and editors. And is this not part of the problem? Because it's a reflection that in our system, conflicts of interests are not really managed. Because theoretically, if you're responsible for an organization, you should not be involved in decision making which directly or indirectly has implications for the funding. And maybe predatory journals and the paper mills are a reflection of the pressure and the failure of the system.
I like this idea very much. I think your point just stands. Can I just raise it? Is it okay? Just one quick comment, just like a counterpoint, even though I agree with you, basically. The counterpoint, and I think he wouldn't mind me saying this, Professor Adrian Barnett at QUT, where I used to work, made a good point that the ARC were looking for people to steer the way they're funding, and they explicitly said you couldn't be on it if you ever had ARC funding, right? And so you get the opposite problem, that the people deciding have never themselves received any of this funding and don't know about it. So somehow we have to find this balance. I think transparency might be part of the solution, but I think your point is a great one.
Firstly, a comment about fake authorship,
Yes.
and that is that it is possible that an author's name and credentials could be used without their knowledge. So penalising them without due process is probably an issue, and that would have to come from the universities, I would have thought, if they were associated with the university. In our journal, we've been wondering whether or not we can do something at the university level and put more onus or responsibility on the university for confirming the credentials of the authors on a paper we receive. And that can be a challenge globally. In one case, we retracted a paper 2 years after it was submitted, after it was found to have fraudulent images in it. And we wrote to the institution that was the lead author's institution and got no response whatsoever. Yep. And in another case where we suspected it and the paper was rejected, we also wrote to the institution and got no response, which is pretty common. So we're stuck at looking at the potential credentials of an author, whether they have an ORCID, and whether the ORCID stands to inspection by us, and so on and so forth. But it's still very limiting to try and pick up, paper mill generated papers, I think.
Sorry, well, I agree. I share your experience and the frustration of institutions that don't respond. We've escalated it in those situations. We write straight to the journal. We say we don't have the corresponding author, but our author is not. We've provided straightforward evidence. One tries to escalate it as best they can. I just sympathise though because I've shared the problem. I don't know if the whole authorship checking at scale could be done at an institution. I don't know whether it would be worth it, but I'm open to the idea. It's interesting. Yeah.
It'd be worth it if the universities were prepared to put money behind it, because they have a reputation to uphold too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and I think institutions should be concerned by authorship. Yeah.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for the session. And we have a little certificate for you.
Superb.
And a present, I believe.
Cool.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, real pleasure. Thank you.